In the previous lesson of this module, you've learned what a transaction is. In order to control how SQL Server treats your data modification statements, you need to use TCL statements. By enclosing batches between begin transaction and commit transaction, you can identify the units of work to be performed together, and in cases where an error occurs, you can use the rollback transaction statement to provide points of recovery in your code. In this lesson, you will learn how to mark the beginning of units of work with the begin transaction statement, how to mark successful completion of batches with commit transaction statement, how to undo failed transactions with rollback transaction statement, and how to use exact abort to automatically roll back failed T-SQL statements. So, let's get started. SQL Server will automatically wrap individual data modification statements like inserts, updates, and deletes in their own transactions, which auto-commit on success and auto-rollback on failure. Which means that when you have individual statements, successful inserts will write their values to the target tables, but when a statement fails, it won't leave any values behind. But for the most part, when you write code, it won't be on individual statements. So if you need to identify a group of statements as a transactional unit of work, you cannot rely on this automatic behavior. Instead, you will need to manually specify the boundaries of the unit. To mark the start of a transaction, you need to use the begin transaction statement, which can also be stated as begin tran. If you are using T-SQL structured exception handling, you will want to begin the transaction inside a try block so that you can decide within the exception handler whether to commit or roll back the transaction depending on its outcome. Begin transaction represents a point at which the data referenced by a connection is logically and physically consistent. If errors are encountered, all data modifications made after the begin transaction can be rolled back to return the data to this known state of consistency. Once you initialize a transaction, you must properly end the transaction. You can use commit transaction on success or rollback transaction on failure. Each transaction lasts until either it completes without errors and commit transaction is issued to make the modifications a permanent part of the database, or errors are encountered and all modifications are erased with the rollback transaction statement, or until the originating connection is dropped, at which point SQL Server will roll the transaction back automatically. A transaction's scope is the connection in which it was started. Transactions cannot span connections. While transactions may be nested, inner transactions will be rolled back even though they are committed if the outer transaction rolls back. Therefore, nested transactions are not typically useful in user code. This code here shows how to mark the start of a transaction's work. Begin transaction starts a local transaction for the connection issuing the statement. Depending on the current transaction isolation level settings, many resources acquired to support the transact SQL statements issued by the connection are logged by the transaction until it is completed with either a commit transaction or rollback transaction statement. Transactions left outstanding for long periods of time can prevent other users from accessing these locked resources and also can prevent log truncation. And if you're using nested transactions, one thing to remember is that if a rollback transaction statement is issued without a transaction name parameter at any level of the set of nested transactions, it rolls back all of the nested transactions including the outermost transaction. Now that you've seen how to begin a transaction, let's see how to commit it. Once the statements in your transaction have completed without errors, you need to instruct SQL Server to end the transaction. To do this, you can use the commit transaction statement. The commit statement marks the end of a successful implicit or explicit transaction, and it also ensures all of the transaction's modifications are made a permanent part of the database. It also frees the resources such as logs used by the transaction. It is the responsibility of the T-SQL programmer to issue the commit transaction statement only at a point when all the data referenced by the transaction is logically correct. And if you are using T-SQL structured exception handling, you will want to commit the transaction inside the try block in which you began it. When used in nested transactions, commits of the inner transaction do not free the resources or make their modifications permanent. The data modifications are made permanent and resources are freed only when the outer transaction is committed. And one thing to note is that you cannot roll back a transaction after a commit transaction statement is issued because the data modifications have already been made a permanent part of the database. Now let's see how to roll back a transaction. In order to end a failed transaction, you'll use the rollback command. Rollback undoes any modifications made to the data during the transaction, reverting it to the state it was in when the transaction started. This includes rows inserted, deleted, or updated, as well as objects created. Rollback also allows SQL Server to release the resources such as logs that are held during the transaction's lifespan. The rollback statement rolls back an explicit or implicit transaction to the beginning of the transaction or to a save point inside the transaction, which means you can use rollback transaction to erase all the data modifications made from the start of the transaction or to a certain point in the transaction. Before issuing a rollback command, you may want to test to see if a transaction is active. You can use the t-SQL's exact state function to determine if there is an active transaction that needs to be rolled back. This can help avoid errors being raised inside the catch block. A rollback transaction statement does not produce any messages to the user. If you require warnings inside the stored procedures or triggers, you can use the print statement to indicate the errors. If you are using t-SQL's structured exception handling, you will want to roll back the transaction inside the catch block that follows the try block containing the begin and commit statements. And like discussed earlier, a transaction cannot be rolled back after a commit transaction statement is executed, except when the commit transaction is associated with a nested transaction that is contained within the transaction that is being rolled back. In this instance, the nested transaction will also be rolled back even if you have issued a commit transaction for it. Now let's see how to use the exact state function to issue a rollback statement only if the transaction is active but cannot be committed. Let's use the example that we've seen before, and let's add if exact state is equal to -1, then begin the rollback transaction. Now let's execute this transaction, click on execute, and it will roll back the transaction only when the transaction is active but cannot be committed. The exact state function returns 3 results. It returns a 0 when there is no active user transactions, 1 when the current request has an active, committable user transaction, and a -1 if the current request has an active user transaction but an error has occurred, and this transaction can only be rolled back. So, now that we have seen how to use the exact state function, let's see how to use exactAbort to automatically roll back transactions when an error occurs. As you have seen, SQL Server does not automatically roll back transactions when an error occurs. In this module, most of the discussion about controlling transactions has assumed the use of try-catch blocks to perform the logic and either commit or roll back a transaction. For situations in which you're not using the try-catch blocks, another option exists for automatically rolling back a transaction when an error occurs. To roll back a statement, you can either use the rollback statement in error handling logic or enable exactAbort. The exactAbort setting can be used to specify whether SQL Server rolls back the current transaction when a runtime error occurs during the execution of T-SQL code. By default, exactAbort is off. You can change this setting using the set command. When set exactAbort is on, the entire transaction is terminated and rolled back if an error occurs, unless the error occurs in a try block. An error in a try block leaves the transaction open but uncommittable irrespective of the setting of the exactAbort. Since set exactAbort on instructs SQL Server to roll back the entire transaction and abort the batch when a runtime error occurs, it covers you in cases like a command timeout occurring on the client application rather than within SQL Server itself. Since a query timeout will leave the transactions open, set exactAbort on is recommended in all stored procedures with explicit transactions. So, now that we have learned about exactAbort, let's see what we've learned so far in this module. We have learned what a transaction is and what the differences are between batches and transactions and how transactions extend the batches. and how to control the transactions using begin, commit, and rollback transaction statements, and how to use exact_abort to automatically roll back failed T-SQL statements. In the next module, you will learn how to improve the performance of a query.